About that title, it's not the size of your data, it's what you do with it that counts. Now, I'm not trying to compare this Tech20 to appearing at the Edinburgh Fringe, but you may know that the marketing for these shows has to be produced months in advance. So the performers of those presentations, those shows, have to come up with a catchy title, which is going to produce or attract enough publicity so we get a big enough audience. And then they have to go through a process of developing and writing their script so that it's tailored to that audience. When it comes to presenting data, we can go through that same process ourselves. So, what do I know about my audience in the room today? Well, you're clearly attracted to double entendre. So, how big is my data? Well, I'm afraid during this presentation my data sets are fairly small. But by the end of this, I'm hoping to show you some pretty big numbers. This is the sort of thing I'd like us to work together to try and solve. It didn't take me very long to find these examples of how not to do data graphics. There's bad visualizations everywhere. The sort of things that we're looking at here are clutter, cognitive overload, data bling, and just not knowing how to use the tools. So we're going to go back to basics and learn how we can avoid some of these mistakes. I grew up in the 70s when computers, the internet, and social media were a long, long way off. But rather than sit around waiting for those things to be invented, we read books. And the types of books that I read were about space and dinosaurs and things like that. And what made those books so fantastic was the way that they presented information. They used colorful images, exciting graphics. And the information that they presented stood up to being read many, many times. So it deepened the way I learned that subject. So what we're going to look at today is some of the tips and techniques that they used. Things like relatability, focus, consistency, and good design. One of the first things that the publishers of those books got right was that they really understood their audience, and they tailored their presentation to suit that audience. They made it comfortable and relatable. They didn't try and address too many audiences, and they didn't try and widen the scope of their presentation too much. In marketing, we call that segmentation. And back when I was a 10-year-old, anything that fell into that middle intersection was going to be right up my street. So when it comes to considering your audience, it's going to inform the way that you plan your presentation. It's going to change the context you use, the language you use. It's going to change your arguments. And it's going to inform the calls to action that you make as well. So if you've considered your audience, you should also think about how you can make best use of their time and attention. That's the difference between exploratory and explanatory visualizations. By the time you get your visualizations in front of your audience, you should have done all your research, you've made your conclusions, and you're making a clear call to action. When we were at school, even if we got the wrong answer, we would get credit for showing the working out. But when it comes to data graphics, that's not a good tactic. Here's an example of that on a grand scale. The designer of this is making the audience do a ton of work before you can get any value from it. There's over 1,000 data points in here. There's over 150 words in the footnote. And the legend has about 12 categories, and some of those are indistinguishable from each other. If we take this more simplistic example, imagine if you're a manager of an IT help desk and you're looking to get additional resources for your department. You might show them this graphic and wonder why their answer isn't an instantaneous yes. It's because you're asking them to do all the same exploratory work that you've already done, and you're not actually asking for anything here. Take the same data in this graphic. This graphic has everything, right from the call to action. Please approve the hire of 2 full-time employees. Why? To backfill those who quit in the past year. And then the graphic walks you through a story. From January to May, things were going great, and then the 2 employees quit. after a valiant attempt to keep things going, things started to go pear-shaped by August. Clear, plain, simple. The audience has walked through the graphic, they don't have to do any decoding themselves, and basically all you have to do is say yes. We can use these sort of techniques in our graphics ourselves. So, how do we minimize the amount of work that we ask our audiences to do? We can leverage the power of our different types of memory that we have. First of these is iconic memory. Iconic memory is the super fast type of memory that means you are unconsciously aware of things. Like the other three types, this evolved in humans over thousands of years, and in particular for a particular task. This task here, this type of memory, evolved to help our hunter-gatherer ancestors spot either opportunities or threats. In the second type, short-term memory, typically our working memory can hold about 4 visual images at a time. Once we go beyond that, we have to start juggling things in and out of that memory to be able to make sense of things. And that cognitive overload means that the audience has to work harder on decoding what they're seeing rather than actually listening. When we learn things successfully, we move them from short-term to long-term memory. If we've never seen a shape before, we can't associate any meaning to it. But if we've seen a shape before and we've learnt a meaning, then it's very difficult if we see that shape again to disassociate that meaning from it in the future. And we can use that sort of emotive, strong imagery to trigger responses and quick reactions in our audiences. So, we're going to do a quick test here to show you the power of using iconic memory to focus the audience's attention more quickly. I'm just going to put up a screen that's full of numbers, and all I want you to do, thinking about the process that you're using when you're seeing this, is count the number of 3s that you see. So, the correct answer is 8. The reason why that task is so difficult is because there's no visual clues up there to help you with the work that you have to do. You have to search through these 7 rows of numbers looking for shapes, the shape of 3, which can be confused with some of the other shapes that are up there. Now let's see what happens when I make one small change to the block of numbers that's up there. How much easier was that? Same task, same result. But this time we're moving it from a raw exploratory task. The last thing we need to do to move it from exploratory to explanatory is to highlight the results of the analysis for us. There, we can now see it's clear. In fact, it probably couldn't be any clearer. You, the audience, can focus your attention on the fact that there's 8 3s up there, and I, the data designer, can tell you what I want to do with that answer. There's all types of different ways that iconic memory can be used, and we call these preattentive attributes. So in that last example, what we had was the 3s were initially a different shade or intensity, and then we changed the color, the hue, and finally put an enclosure around them again. So we couldn't really miss them. You can use all of these preattentive attributes in your data graphics, but you should be aware that sometimes your eye is drawn more readily to some than others. Then we looked at short-term memory. In this simple example, we can see the problem that we have when we have cognitive overload. Even though it's a simple graph, the fact that we've got 9 categories here means that we have to refer back and forth between the legend and the graph to be able to read this more easily. Finally, we looked at long-term memory. We've got 4 weather maps up here, all of which use learned associations and symbols to help you read the weather. Now, all of these maps are from different days, but they all contain enough information that would let you read the weather and understand what it was going to be like in certain areas of the country. But I would suggest that unless you're exposed to them on a daily basis, these 2 maps are difficult to read. And it's this one here is going to give you the quickest route to be able to tell whether you need to take an umbrella or the sun cream. So that improved readability has come from a long-term exposure and learning what these symbols and colours mean on this map. There's lots of different visualizations that we can use in our graphics. This, I would say, is the basic tool set that we could all use. But even though it's quite a simple set of tools, there's still some guidelines that we need to follow. For example, we should be careful about using tables within our graphics because they engage the verbal parts of the audience's brain, which means that they read them. So why not use the option of the heat map, which color codes the cells according to their value, which leverages that preattentive attribute of color. Quick note on color, use it sparingly and perhaps as a highlight against gray. I tend to use blue because it has less learned associations with it. Remember that long-term memory? So, for example, you have red, which has associations with danger and negativity, and green, which has associations with positivity and acceptance. These graphs along the bottom here, these bar charts, are probably the most simple and versatile ones that we can use. But you can still find they're misused within data graphics. Let me show you an example. You should be aware as an audience that your perception can be manipulated by the agenda of the data designer to suit their agenda. This was a graphic which appeared during Obama's second term in office. I find that Fox News are particularly bad at doing this sort of thing. Let me try and pick what this graph is showing me. By March 31st, the government had a target of signing up just over 7 million people to their Obamacare program. By March 27th, they'd had actually 6 million sign-ups. So how does this graphic make you feel about the success of that program? Does it make you think that the government has massively missed their target? Well, rather than using a normal scale, where you would start the y-axis at 0, this y-axis starts at 5.5 million. They've also used a visual trick of using a super wide bar, which tricks the mind into thinking that the size of the area of that blue rectangle holds some importance. So in addition to a visual difference of 65% in terms of the heights of these bars, this bar on the left is only 1/3 the size of the one on the right. A more accurate and objective representation of this data is this, where we can actually see that the difference is about 15%. I think you'll find that doesn't look quite so impactful. I would suggest that Fox News understands their audience very well, and they know how to manipulate them. So one of the tools that was missing from that tool set was a pie chart. My recommendation is you don't use pie charts at all. When you look at this, which supplier would you say has the highest market share? You'd probably say it was supplier B, the grey section down here. But is their share 35%, 40%? Let me make it a bit easier by putting the values on there. Now we can see that it's actually supplier A by some 3%. There's two things going on here. One, humans aren't actually very good at estimating angles. And the second, the 3D visualization is distorting this and making it difficult for us to read. In fact, 3D hardly ever adds any value to any graphic. I know we've all done it, you press the button that says 3D because you think it makes a cool graph, makes it more interesting. But trust me, it doesn't make the audience's job any easier. So what's the alternative? Well, why not just use a bar chart? Same information, but this graph probably shows it better because you can actually see the ranking and we can compare the values more easily. This is the most accurate pie chart I've seen today. So when it comes to data graphics, I would suggest you skip the desserts. In fact, it's not just on pie charts that we should avoid using 3D. This is a general advisory against 3D altogether. The third dimension is doing nothing for any of these graphics. Here, it's all the problems here are about comparison and legibility. So avoid 3D whenever possible. Unfortunately, bad design is everywhere, so we're going to go into fix-it mode to see if we can avoid some of these mistakes in the future. Sometimes something gets into the mind of a data graphic designer and they want to use some weird visualization. This one, for example, seems to be trying to break all of the rules at once. 3D, pie charts, too many colors, cognitive overload. Why not just use this type of representation, same data, but now you can actually answer the questions that are being posed. Back to misleading the audience. I'll let you decide whether this is misleading by design or by accident. What this graphic is showing is the amount of money that is received by each country from the EU versus the amount that they give to the EU. You can see that there's some inequity on the face of it here. For example, we've got Germany and Greece. But what the designer has done, they've exaggerated that difference by mixing up height and area. When we look at these two triangles, no matter where we put these numbers, our mind is still equating the value to the area of the triangle. In actual fact, the black triangle here has a height of 78 and the red a depth of 164. A much fairer way of representing this is to have the area of the triangle actually represent the value, or just use the height. We shouldn't try to be mixing up both of them. Here's another one with a dubious motive. This is a graph of what happened in Florida when they introduced a stand your ground law. I'm not wanting to get into the politics of a law which explicitly legalized the use of lethal force by homeowners protecting their property. What do you think happened when they introduced that law in 2005? If you thought that the number of deaths went down, then you've been misled by the designer. In actual fact, the scale is upside down, and 0 is up here. The designer of that graphic said that they were influenced by this one here, which appeared in 2011. This is clearly a very impactful, emotive, award-winning graphic. It uses a combination of language, color, and a clever visual trick to get its message across. That same visual trick didn't work in the Florida graph because they put the x-axis down here rather than up here. A more consistent approach to presenting this Florida information would have been this, but probably not the one which suited the agenda of the designer. Sometimes data graphics mislead by accident, no more so than is the case here. Not strictly a data graphic, but it still breaks a lot of the guidelines that we've been discussing. This is part of a presentation that Boeing engineers made to NASA following damage caused to the wing of the space shuttle by foam during launch. On the basis of this presentation, NASA instructed the crew to attempt re-entry, rather than wait for a rescue mission or attempt to repair. On re-entry, the Columbia shuttle disintegrated with a loss of 7 crew members. Yale University's data communications expert, Edward Tufte, analyzed this presentation and had many recommendations. And you probably could guess what some of those recommendations are now you've seen this type of this presentation. But what it boils down to is that the 3 most important pieces of information on this slide in these bullet points are buried amongst another 150 words on that slide, and they're in the smallest font. It could have looked something like this. So the point here is that if you have important information to convey, make sure you do it in a clear and concise way. The last thing I want to talk about is relatability. If you want to make a clear, memorable point, then you need to be able to tie it to the audience experience in some way. Let me show you an example. The number of visible stars in the night sky is around about 10,000. The number of stars in the visible universe is roughly this number. That's 1 quadrillion. There's 24 zeros up there. I did promise you some big numbers by the end of this. If you're lucky, you'll be able to remember these numbers for a while after this presentation. But you'll still have difficulty grasping the size of them because you've got nothing to relate it to in your experience. I had to Google these two numbers, but I still remember the analogy, the following analogy that Carl Sagan made in his Cosmos series in the 1980s. I first heard this when I was nearly 40 years ago when I was a boy, reading all those mind-changing books. The number of grains, the number of stars in the sky is roughly equal to the number of grains in a handful of sand. The number of stars in the observable universe is more than the number of grains on all the beaches on Earth. Sometimes it's not the data that you show to your audience, it's the impact of the message that you leave them with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. So, I'd like to open the floor to questions. We have Hannah with the roving mic exploring. So, has anyone got any questions? Okay, I'll start with one. David, you've worked in oil and gas for a long time. What do you think our challenge is in the way that we present our data that we don't necessarily drive the right decisions?
I think when it comes to the way that our industry does it, we need to be more open in the way that we share our data. Our data sets can be quite closed. It's only when we start to add them together that we get more value from them. I can show you an example of that one. This is an example of one of the first times that data was combined, geographic data was combined with healthcare data by John Snow in 1854. It's not that John Snow.
Game of Thrones John Snow.
Or the other John Snow. Yeah. So this is showing outbreaks of cholera by the air. That's what these little black bits are. And they were able, using this, to pinpoint the actual water pump that led to the cholera outbreak. Now, other cities are opening up their data sources like this. So New York's a great example of this. So they're opening up the data sources and they're getting tremendous insights, not from their own analysis of it, but from the analysis that other people are doing. So you've got things like rat sightings by zip code, and then the most profitable parking meters in New York. In fact, the interesting story about this one was that the most profitable parking meter in New York, the guy who did the research told the authorities, they went to see that meter and they found that the road markings were all different. They were wrong, so by mistake. They only found that out because somebody else did the research. And getting back to that point about what our industry can learn from this is, the more we open up, the more industry data we share, open source, then the more comparisons, research that other people can do, and insights that